This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Tonight I'm going to talk about the core of discovery. Over the course of 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, the core of discovery traveled almost 8,000 miles by foot, by canoe, by horseback, very, very slow miles one at a time. And they brought back with them invaluable geographic and scientific data. Now, here's something you might not know. The primary objective of their military mission was to explore the Mississippi River and find a water path to the Pacific Ocean. That was their primary objective. Their secondary objective was to keep the British from claiming the same area. When they were initiated, the Louisiana Purchase had not been made, and in fact, it wasn't even on the drawing boards. So they had this plan long before the Louisiana Purchase occurred. They had actually started before the Louisiana Purchase was made.
George, when you said they, who is they that had this plan?
They is starting with Jefferson. I'm going to tell you a lot about how the plan was formed. Jefferson initiated it 25 years before it happened.
But was this group a government group, agency, or was it military or what?
It was a military group. It was commissioned by Jefferson and the Congress. So it was a military program. It was not a civilian group of explorers. Okay, here's what the United States looked like in 1800. You can see on the right in yellow, that's where the United States was. They were not all yet states. The pink area is the Louisiana Purchase area. It was actually purchased by the United States from France in 1803. If you look up at the top, it did not include the Northwest Territory. The Spanish territory, in that off green color, extended as it's shown there, and the boundaries of the Spanish territory were not clear. The British were up in the blue area.
And didn't part of that extend into Canada?
Part of what?
The Louisiana Purchase.
It wasn't real clear, and I'll show you a map where it shows some of us did.
Yeah. Okay.
But you have to understand that nobody knew what was up there. But this green area here, this is the unexplored territory that the Corps of Discovery was going into. The first part of their trip, all the way from Camp Wood to Fort Mandan, was known territory. The French had explored it. However, nobody from the United States or America had been there. So this was the major portion that they were going to explore. Now, starting with the journals of Lewis and Clark, these are my main sources for the information that you're going to hear tonight. Lewis and Clark kept very, very extensive journals throughout their whole trip, and they were different from each other. Lewis was better educated than Clark, and Lewis tended to pay attention, call it the social parts of the journey, the technical parts, and the flora and fauna. Clark paid attention to the day-to-day events that were happening. So a lot of the entries that you read from Clark are pretty matter of fact, but Lewis's are much more extensive. It blends the highlights of their journals, both of them, but it also includes voices of enlisted men and of Native people, hearing them alongside, and it's actually done on a day-by-day basis. So on the 13th of July, here's what Lewis had to say, or here's what Clark had to say. Sometimes it was one of the NCOs, sometimes there were Native Americans talking in the journal.
George, how did they communicate with the natives in their native tongue?
Depends on who they were, and depends on where they were. As they were going up through the French territory, they did everything from hand and eye signals to using French to having an interpreter. They ran into so many different people that there was no common way of communicating. The journals depict the herds of bison that they ran into. People from the East had never seen anything like that. Talks about the meetings that they had with Indian peoples, and some of them were a lot more difficult than others. They talk about the beauty of the great falls of the Missouri and the fear that they felt when an illness befell Sacagawea. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about her later on. It includes the Continental Divide crossing. They did not anticipate having to go over a 7,000-foot mountain pass, and it was not easy. The days of cold and hunger, and then about Clark, one of his entries was, "I see the Pacific." Although he was wrong, he didn't see the Pacific. What he saw was something else. It shows the cultural differences between people in the core and the Native Americans. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're poignant, and at least once they're tragic. It's a fascinating story. This book of journals, and the one that I read is an abridged book. I think there were 10 different journals at one point in time. It's just a fascinating story. I also used, by Stephen Ambrose, the book Undaunted Courage. It really is the biography of Meriwether Lewis. So he's focusing on Lewis, but he talks a great deal in this book. And I was trying to determine whether what you would call this book. It's not exactly a fact history book, and it's certainly not a fiction book. It's probably something that they call faction, because he has people talking and he couldn't have possibly known what they were talking about. It's also the story of William Clark. Clark was the co-commander with Lewis, but he doesn't spend much time in Undaunted Courage talking about Clark. Sadly, it's also a tragedy. Lewis received a hero's welcome when he returned to Washington in 1806. However, he did not accomplish what Jefferson wanted to see accomplished. Jefferson wanted a water route to the Pacific. They were unable to find such a route. As I said, they had to go over a 7,000-foot mountain. With a mixture of political intrigue, speculation, and poor administration, Lewis took to drink and he piled up debts. Lewis fell apart after he got back to the United States. It ended badly. The book Undaunted Courage ends badly. Now, I think you need this for context. What was the U.S. Army and its officer corps like after the Revolution? The United States was a minor military power. They had a small army, a small Marine Corps, and a small Navy. We were in no position to be fighting anybody about anything. When John Adams was president, now remember, he preceded Jefferson, they started to expand the army. And what Adams did was he appointed a lot of Federalists, that was his party, officers. They added almost as many officers as they added enlisted men. And it was political. That was, at that point in time, the Federalist way of achieving the kind of influence that they wanted in the United States. Both Lewis and Clark served in this small army. Now, when Jefferson became president, he became president in 1802. One of his priorities was to reduce this Federalist political support base. So one of Jefferson's priorities was to change the makeup of the U.S. Army as it existed at that point in time. One of Meriwether Lewis's role as Jefferson's secretary was to facilitate this reduction. In other words, because of his service in the Army, Lewis knew a lot of these officers. He knew which ones were good soldiers. He knew which ones were political bums. Congress actually controlled the Army, especially the funding of the Army. So even though the president could take steps, the purse strings were held by Congress. The purse strings were held by Congress throughout all of the events that we're talking about this evening. Just a little bit of information about Jefferson. You know, he was a statesman, diplomat, yada, yada, yada. Third president of the United States from 1801 until 1809. One of his goals was to find the most direct and practicable water communication across the continent. This is what he said was his goal. His purpose was commerce. He felt that having a water route across the continent would improve commerce in the fledgling United States.
George, one little thing about Lewis and Clark. You said they served in the Army. Were they given an officership or a commission or what?
They both eventually had commissions. Clark did not start with a commission. Actually, Lewis was called an ensign when he first, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, he was in a different army to the U.S. Army that Adams developed. And I'll explain to you as we get through what that was like. But yes, they were both in militia. They were not in the U.S. Army. They were both officers in militias.
Thank you.
In 1802, Jefferson read a man named Alexander Mackenzie's 1801 book about his overland expedition across Canada. So in 1792-93, the Corps of Discovery was preempted by this British expedition that went across Canada to the Pacific Ocean. He had always had an interest in doing this. As he read that book, he immediately initiated the Corps of Discovery. These British exploratory journals influenced his decision to create this Corps of Discovery, and he wanted them to be able to reach the Pacific as well as the British had done. His underlying intention was to keep the British from coming south. And that did not get rectified, or at least clarified, for quite some time. In 1803, he officially commissioned the expedition. It was funded by Congress for something like $35,000. When the eventual bills came in, and there were a lot of bills that came in a lot of different ways, they had not overspent overspent the congressional allocation. Now, whether or not they had a lot of other expenses or not, I don't know. But funded by Congress in February of 03. Now, who was Meriwether Lewis? He was an explorer, a soldier, politician, and an administrator. He's best known for his role as the leader of the Corps of Discovery. He was a member of the Virginia aristocracy. And if you know a little bit about Virginia history, there were families like the Jeffersons, like the Lees, like the Randolphs. The Lewises were in that social strata. However, his family fortunes waxed and waned. His mother wound up going to Georgia. And back before the 1800s, Georgia was really backwooded. He had no formal education until he was 13 years old. So as a young person, he developed as a hunter and as an outdoorsman. He was appointed private secretary to Jefferson, whom he through Virginia society. You got to realize how old he was when this happened. He was like 26 years old. But he was Jefferson's personal secretary long before the Corps of Discovery was initiated. Part of his role was to facilitate the paring down of the officers' corps of the Federalist Party members. He became a close acquaintance of Jefferson while he was in the role of personal secretary. He became the natural selection to lead the Corps of Discovery. Now, let me talk a little bit about the preparation for the journey. The United States at the turn of the century had 5.3 million people, of whom 800,000 were slaves. More than 50% of the continent of North America was claimed by either France, Spain, or Great Britain, and most of that territory was uninhabited. So what you see on that map, which is where the United States is only a small portion of the land that actually consists of the North American continent. Jefferson wanted to expand, and this was reading Ambrose. I haven't ever read this anyplace else, but what Ambrose said was Jefferson was aware of what happened when you plant tobacco, and he saw the West as the kind of land that was going to be needed for the long-term cultivation of kinds of crops that they were growing in the East. So land usage, as much as anything else, fit Jefferson's intent to expand. And I always thought that Jefferson was an agrarian and not into a national expansion, not according to Ambrose. Now, the English had already explored Canada as far as the Pacific Ocean, and Jefferson saw both opportunity to do the same thing, and he also saw the danger if he didn't. Detailed planning began in 1802. Remember that date because Louisiana Purchase is the following year. The challenges were enormous. First of all, where's the money going to come from? The United States was not a wealthy country in 1802. They also had to design and develop the leadership of the expedition. What kinds of information did they want to collect? How many people were going to go on it? And on and on. So the planning began in 1802. One of the first things that Lewis did was to get educated in science. Jefferson set up for him a whole series of tutorials with different specialists in botany and medicine and geology and zoology and astronomy. I mean, he wanted Meriwether Lewis to be the scientist of this expedition, in addition to being the leader of this group of people. He also had to learn about organizing and operating an expedition, and then finally Native American cultures. It was a very, very complicated planning activity. And as they say, as soon as you get started, you can take the plans and toss them out the window. Where did it start? It started in Pittsburgh. Because they had to take so many supplies with them, and most of the supplies were things they were going to either give to or trade with the Native Americans. But they were also weapons, there was also food. So they had a keelboat built, and that's the replica of the keelboat on the right. It was 55 feet long, 8 feet wide, had an elevated deck for a cabin. The keelboat was to be the main vehicle around which the expedition would be operated. At the front of it, you see a small cannon mounted. However, after they made a contract for the keelboat manufacturer spent a significant amount of time drunk, and the keelboat was not ready on time. So the trip down the Ohio, they started in Pittsburgh with part of the Corps. They had to go down the Ohio first to St. Louis. That trip did not go as planned because the boat was at least a month late in construction. The biggest single problem as they went down the Ohio was low water. This keel boat, even though it didn't have a very deep draft, it had enough draft that in the fall, the river was too shallow for it. So if you read the journals and you read the Ambrose's details about that trip, the first part of the trip was a lot more difficult than they ever anticipated. They also had problems with storage of materials. It rained and the materials got wet. They had a lot of trouble before they ever got to St. Louis. They picked up Clark and some additional crew near Louisville. They arrived in St. Louis, which at that time was a French town. Remember, 1803 is the transition of the Louisiana Purchase, so there aren't any Americans living in the Louisiana area other than an occasional trapper. St. Louis was a French town. It was run by French oligarchs, and that's who Lewis and Clark wound up trading with. But they got to St. Louis in December of 1803. The first thing they did outside of St. Louis was set up winter quarters. And what they had to do there was add more supplies and make final preparations for the Corps of Discovery. This really was a shakedown cruise, and they discovered lots of problems. Nobody in the United States had ever done anything like this before. Think about what you'd run into if you were doing something that no one had ever done before. William Clark, the other leader, he was born in 1770. He was the younger brother of George Rogers Clark, who was a Revolutionary War general. He had no formal education at all. His journal of the expedition is very comprehensive of day-to-day activities. But as you read his journal, you have some trouble with his spelling in particular and his grammar in general. He was not well educated at all, but he could read and write. He joined the militia at 19. So he joined the militia in 1789. They were having Indian troubles in the latter part of the 18th century. He then joined something I'm going to tell you about, the Legion of the United States. That's a term I had never heard before. He joined the Legion of the United States as a lieutenant. During his service, he became friends with Meriwether Lewis, and they developed a strong respect for each other, but particularly Lewis was respectful of Clark's skills as a frontiersman. Among his contributions to the expedition, he prepared an extensive map of the unexplored Northwest Territory. And this is what his map looked like. Okay, this is the map. This was all a blank. Remember back to the early map that I showed you that was green, it said unexplored area? That's what this was. He prepared that while they were out on the West Coast. He also led, and I'm going to talk some more later about this, an exploration of the Yellowstone River on the return trip. After they got back, Jefferson appointed Clark as Brigadier General of the militia in the Louisiana Territory. So in addition to some money and some land, that's what his reward was from Jefferson. He was also made U.S. Agent for Indian Affairs in the territory. A big job. That's William Clark. Now, the Legion of the United States, I had never heard of this. It was a reorganization of the Continental Army. It only lasted 4 years, 1792 to 1796. It was under the command of Major General Mad Anthony Wayne. It represented a political shift in the new United States. The United States had just adopted the United States Constitution. Prior to the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation had no national military. What they had was a variety of militia, but they did not have an integrated national military. The new congressional and executive branches authorized a standing army to be composed of professional soldiers rather than relying on state militias. This happened in 1792. I'd never heard this story. The Legion was formed in reaction. They were really being soundly drugged, these militias, by the Native Americans. They also wanted to assert sovereignty over borders in the Western Territories and the Great Lakes region. So by the early 1790s, they realized they needed an army, and this is the group of people who originally formed that army. The Legion was reduced in size and rechristened the Army of the United States in 1796. That's the army that we belong to. That's the Legion of the United States. Now, the Louisiana Purchase, and looking at this picture, Jerry, you can see up at the very top that at least when this map was drawn, they thought that part of the Louisiana Purchase went up into Alberta and Saskatchewan. I don't know how that got resolved. That wasn't on my to-do list.
Yeah, it was about 1850 is when it got resolved.
Is that right?
Yeah.
The Kingdom of France. France originally settled this area, remember? They had controlled the Louisiana Territory from the early expeditions in the 17th century until it was ceded to Spain in 1762. It was ceded to Spain at the Treaty of Fontainebleau as a consequence of the 7 Years' War, and I guess that was between Spain and France. I don't know anything about the 7 Years' War, but that's how Spain got it. In 1800, Napoleon regained ownership of Louisiana. And if you'll remember the program that I did on Napoleon, he conquered Spain. Part of the conquering of Spain was they ceded him ownership of the Louisiana Territory. But however, Napoleon very quickly realized this was an albatross. It was across an ocean that there wasn't anything he was going to do about. He could not do anything with this territory that he owned. It was impractical for him to retain the authority, if you will, of the Louisiana Territory. So the purchase negotiations started about New Orleans. The American and the French ambassadors started talking about what would it take to get New Orleans made a part of the United States. It evolved into the Louisiana Territory, the whole Louisiana Territory. It didn't start out that way. It started out that all they wanted was New Orleans. Negotiation for New Orleans became the whole claimed area. James Monroe, and I believe he was Secretary of State at the time, bought it all. And by the way, he bought it all without the authority to buy anything. The constitutionality of the purchase was unclear. Such a transaction was not within the authority of the executive branch of the government of the United States. However, the Senate did ratify it later. The official announcement of the purchase was made on July 4th, 1803. The treaty was ratified in October. And if you'll remember, by October, Lewis was halfway down the Ohio River. So it really didn't have much to do with the Louisiana Purchase. It just kind of fit the routine that was going on. Now, who was the core of discovery? Lewis and Clark were its co-leaders. However, Lewis had been made a captain and Clark was a lieutenant. This was despite the fact that Lewis said he wanted Clark to be made a captain also and to be co-leaders. However, in their infinite wisdom, somehow the government never actually made him a captain. However, Lewis promoted him to captain in terms of how he dealt with him, what he talked to the soldiers about, how he was introduced and whatnot. So as far as Lewis is concerned, he was a captain, but he was officially just a lieutenant. The crew varied in size. Eventually, it numbered 28 soldiers. They were all enlisted men. They were paid $15 a month and 400 acres of land when they returned, if they returned. They were selected one at a time by Clark and by Lewis. They were looking for their skills as a frontiersman, but other special skills, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the special skills. Many were rejected, so it wasn't like they took anybody who wanted to go. Some of them actually got as far as Fort Mandan and were then sent back, usually for disciplinary reasons. There were 3 sergeants in the Corps of Discovery. They had a mixture of responsibilities, everything from boat commander to a pirogue or some other form of transportation. They functioned as NCOs always have functioned. They were the day-to-day leaders of the activities. Discipline was a perennial problem. The primary problem that they had to deal with was drunkenness, but they also had AWOLs. They even had several desertions and the usual soldierly contentiousness, like fighting. This I thought was interesting. If you did something, you got a court-martial. Court-martials were held by Lewis and Clark. If they found you guilty, punishment was commonly 100 lashes. And they handed those out pretty liberally. So a lot of these soldiers were
George,
whipped.
where'd they get the alcohol?
They brought it with them.
Okay.
They had something on the order of 100 gallons of alcohol when they started out, because part of it was to give everybody a tot of grog every day, like the Navy. Another part of it was to use it for trading with the Native Americans. They had a lot of booze, and the troops found out how to get in it without authorization. Now, the Native Americans, at least as far as Fort Mandan, had been trading with the French for years. But the number of native tribes that they were going to encounter was completely unknown. And they didn't know who they were once they got past Mandan. Lewis was given explicit instructions: make friends with them. Do not create issues. Do not get into fights with them. And Lewis was very careful to operate from this basis of priority, if you will.
George, Fort Mandan, is that in Louisiana or?
So I'll show you where it is. It's at the north of the Louisiana Territory. Fort Mandan was the last outpost of white settlers, white traders. People went past there, but nobody had come back with any kind of information past there. Mandan, by the way, was an Indian tribe. There were 2 tribes up in the Fort Mandan area. One was the Mandans and the others were the Auriculas. But what they had with them was a lot of gifts. Everything that they carried with them was to demonstrate to the Native Americans the potential for future trading affiliations with the United States. By now, this was the United States territory by the time they got up the Missouri. They also wanted to send representative leaders of these Native American tribes back to St. Louis because they wanted the new government to see who they were dealing with. They demonstrated to the Native Americans their weaponry, and for the most part, none of them had ever seen anything like the weapons that they had, but they were very, very strictly enjoined from trading any guns with the Native Americans. The Oto were the first tribe to be told, and this is what Lewis's message was invariably, and he told this to every single tribe that they encountered. You as a Native American now have a new country. If you act right, you will be rewarded. You act badly and you will be punished. You have a new great white father. Remember that and behave yourself. That was a speech that Lewis gave so many times, I suspect. And as you said before, sometimes he had an interpreter. Sometimes I suspect it was kind of a pidgin English. Sometimes it was sign language. Sometimes they understood him and sometimes they didn't. Among the tribes that they encountered, now I'm still on the first leg of the journey, going up the Missouri. The Sioux were the most aggressive. And why the Sioux were that kind of culture, I don't know. But if you read about the people they had trouble with, the Sioux were first on their list. The second most difficult group was the Blackfeet. Now, they went up the Missouri to the Mandan village, formerly set out from St. Louis, 21st of May, 1804. They still had the keel boat and several heavily laden pirogues. And this is what a pirogue looks like. It's a large canoe. Sometimes it had a mast. You could put a sail on it if you wanted to. Corps had as many going up the Missouri as 45. However, many of those would come back once they reached the village. The primary means of travel, now you're going upriver, were oars and tow ropes. What they found was sailing was just incredibly slow. So what they had was people on the shores with tow ropes and using oars. The crew in this part of the voyage became more and more skilled. There were encounters with Indians. There were encounters with the prairies and wildlife. And as I said earlier, some of the encounters with the Sioux were very aggressive. They never reached the stage of hostility going upriver, but it was very close. On August the 20th, the only person to die on this journey, a sergeant whose name was Charles Floyd, died apparently from appendicitis. However, Floyd had been bitten by a poisonous snake, and whether or not that was connected to his death or not, they weren't real clear. He was the only member of the Corps of Discovery to die during the expedition. They arrived at this village, the Mandan village, which was a major trading site in late October, and they built this fort immediately. This is Fort Mandan. This is what the Corps of Discovery built at the site of the Mandan villages. Now, what did winter look like, 0405? As I said, they built a fort. They needed it for safety during the winter. They spent the winter hunting. They spent it interacting with the Mandans and the Arikaras. They spent it trading, and they spent it socializing. Syphilis was one of the major problems that the Corps had. Apparently, it was very commonplace to have sexual relations with the Native American women. In fact, they were open for trade with that as one of the trading gambits. They built a forge. Remember I said that some of the members had special skills? They built a forge and they produced materials like axes for trade. And they were very highly prized by the Native Americans because they had never seen anything like that. So they took small pieces of steel, made them into an axe, and then traded them. And they built their own, they did their own blacksmithing work, if you will. They hired Toussaint Charbonneau, whose wife, Sacagawea, spoke Shoshone. And it's really interesting if you read the journal about that event, she's not even mentioned by name. They had a lot of trouble hiring Charbonneau. He wanted more than they were willing to give him. However, eventually he relented. They had a foraging party that they would go out from this during the day and hunt animals and whatnot. They were attacked by a Sioux raiding party, but they were unable to catch them. They repaired and sent the keel boat back to St. Louis, along with a number of canoes and men who had helped row it to the village, and several soldiers, one of whom had been caught as a deserter who was kicked off of the Corps of Discovery. They sent records to St. Louis with the keel boat, flora and fauna, maps of the river basin, etc. On April the 7th, 1805, the expedition left Fort Mandan and headed up the Missouri, now in pirogues only. I shouldn't say only. They also had some canoes. Sacagawea. She was the daughter of a Shoshone chief. The Shoshone were in that unexplored area. She was captured by an enemy tribe, sold to a French-Canadian trapper who made her his wife at the age of 12. In November of 1804, her husband joined the expedition as a guide. She was allowed to come along because she spoke Shoshone and nobody else did, and they thought they might need that kind of skill in their group. Even though she was pregnant. So she was pregnant when they started out. She was still chosen to accompany them on their mission, and the baby was born on the trip. Lewis and Clark believed that her knowledge of the language would help them later in the journey, and they were correct. She was instrumental in securing horses, and once they got to the headwaters of the Missouri, they still had to go across the Rocky Mountains, and they needed horses to cross them. They got them from the Shoshone. She was also an important guide as they crossed the mountains. She died apparently in another childbirth in 1814. Up the Missouri to the Rockies. The Corps was now in 6 canoes and 2 pirogues, all still heavily laden. This is what the Great Falls of the Missouri River look like today. The men split up. Some were in canoes, but some are walking the shore. And this was true throughout the walk up the Missouri. Their biggest single problem was which one was the real Missouri River. Because as tributaries came in, it was hard to decide which one was the dominant river and which one was a feeder. The way they did it was width of the river. The wider river coming into the junction was considered to be the Missouri. They followed the Missouri up to the Great Falls, which had to be portaged for 18 miles. So back to these 6 canoes and 2 pirogues and all of the material that were in them. Now they had to portage it for 18 miles. In late July, they reached the headwaters of the Missouri. Sacagawea helped them get the support and the horses of the Shoshone for their trek through the Rockies. They crossed the Bitterroot Mountains at 7,000 feet in mid-September. There was a water route. They could not follow it because it was too steep on the sides in terms of canyons. The water was totally unmanageable. So they did not try to follow the water route. They went through a pass in the Bitterroots. To the Pacific, they emerged from the mountains to the Weippe Prairie, where they were taken in by the Nez Perce Indians. What they did there was camp along the Idaho Clearwater River to build new canoes. They left the horses there, by the way. On the Snake River, they reached the Columbia at the present-day Tri-Cities, and some of you might know where these are: Kennewick, Pasco, and Richland. I'm not sure I know where they are. They're out in western Washington State, I believe. On October the 18th, they saw Mount Hood. On November the 7th, now they're going downriver now, remember. Clark's journal says, "Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean." And this is the way he spelled ocean, by the way. However, they hadn't sighted the ocean. They were still up here in the estuary. They were still 20 miles from the Pacific Ocean. They reached the Pacific itself November the 15th, 1806. Now, what did they do over that winter? They built a fort called Fort Klatt. Fort Klatt is named after the Klatt Indians who inhabited that area. And these were not big tribes. A given tribe might have 200 to 250 altogether. There were a lot of these small tribes. First, they squabbled about where to build the site. But once they decided where they were going to build it, it took 3 weeks to build the fort. It served as their camp from December the 8th until their departure in March in 1806. The winter of 1805-1806 was a long, if you read their journals, it was not a fun time. If you've been in the Pacific Northwest in this time of the year, it rains all the damn time. It led to boredom and restlessness in the Corps, and by now they were out of booze. Big problem. They passed the time hunting deer and elk. However, the meat spoiled very quickly. They also made salt. So a group of them actually went down to the Pacific Ocean and boiled salt water to make salt. They used it both for themselves, salting meat, and for trading. The Native Americans were responsive, using salt as trading material. Lewis spent most of his time at Fort Klatt documenting the journey, taking notes on the wildlife, on the terrain, and other features. Meanwhile, Clark was drawing that map I showed you. That map was foundational to further development of the Northwest Territory. It was the only map that existed. Occasionally, they traded with the Klatt Indians. However, they disliked these particular group of Indians. They felt they were untrustworthy and they were prone to stealing. They were ready to leave as spring emerged. Now we're into the spring of 1806. Homeward Bound. March, the Corps left Fort Klatt for home in canoes going up the Columbia. They got to where the Nez Perce was. They got their horses back. However, the snow was still covering the Rockies and they had to wait. So they actually started out earlier than they needed to. However, the way you read the journals, they were much happier with the Nez Perce than they had been with the Klatt. They traversed the mountains. Now they're through the Bitterroots. And what happened was Lewis and Clark split up at a place called Lolo Pass in July to further explore the area. Lewis group took a shortcut next to the Great Falls of the Missouri and explored something called the Marias River. And what he was hoping, and here is where the Marias is, what he was hoping is it was going to lead up into Canada, which would give them a better excuse for claiming the northern part of this river. However, it didn't do that. It just went west up into the mountains. It was a tributary of the Missouri, currently now in present-day Montana. Clark, his group, including Sacagawea and her family, went south. And what he did was explored the Yellowstone. And these are two totally separate. Now they're out in the middle of nowhere, something like 75 miles from each other, not having any idea where the other ones were for a period of almost 2 months. And the idea was that they were going to meet where the Missouri and the Yellowstone came together. Lewis's group encountered 8 Blackfeet. The Blackfeet stole some things from Lewis's group. Lewis's group tried to get them back and had to kill 2 of them. It was the only violent episode of the entire trip. The two groups planned to rendezvous where the Yellowstone and the Missouri meet in North Dakota. The rest of the trip, on August the 12th, Lewis and Clark and their crews reunited, so they were actually apart 6 weeks. They dropped off Sacagawea and her family at the Mandan villages. They headed down the Missouri River. Now the currents were moving in their favor. They arrived in St. Louis, September the 23rd, 1806. They had been gone 2.5 years. They were received with a hero's welcome. However, they had failed to identify a Northwest Passage water route across the continent. And even though Jefferson was very positive about their explorations, he never got quite past that he didn't get what he really wanted. However, they had completed their mission, surveying the Louisiana Territory from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, even though the Louisiana Territory didn't go that far. They strengthened America's claim to the Pacific Northwest, including a sizable area here that wasn't in the Louisiana Purchase. How did it end? Lewis and Clark were accorded hero status in Washington when they got back. The accounting process was a little convoluted. Congress squabbled about who was going to pay for what. One of the things that the Congress wanted was receipts for all of these things, many of which didn't exist. The squabbling really started when people started writing books about it, and the journals were initiated. Lewis's journal went in for publication in about this time, and it never came out of publication in his lifetime. He just didn't get around to publishing it. However, Jefferson made him governor of the Louisiana Territory. Clark was made territorial militia commander. In that job, Lewis functioned very, very erratically. His priorities for the territory were not consistent with Jefferson. Lewis's priorities had to do with settlement, Native American interface, personnel kinds of things. Jefferson was interested in commerce. So they didn't see eye to eye, is the fairest thing to say about it. After deteriorating physically and mentally, Lewis committed suicide in 1809. The journals were not published for another 5 years. So the journals that I talked about at the very beginning were not published in Lewis's lifetime. Somebody else had to do the publishing. Epilogue. You might be interested in this and something called the Adams-Onus Treaty of 1819. It was a treaty between the United States and Spain. It defined the boundaries between the United States and New Spain. Spain had given up on Florida, so the Spanish government agreed to cede the territory of Florida to the United States in this particular treaty. If you remember Manifest Destiny, this was one of the stages in Manifest Destiny. In exchange, the boundary dispute along the Sabine River in Texas was settled. That's this area here. So in 1819, the United States agreed that that was the border between the U.S. and New Spain. The treaty established the boundary of the United States territory and claims through the Rocky Mountains and west to the Pacific Ocean. This whole area had never been officially claimed by anybody. It was now claimed by the United States. In exchange, the United States relinquished claims to parts of Spanish Texas west of the Sabine River and other Spanish areas under the terms of the Louisiana Purchase. And the story was just beginning. The next thing that happened was Mexico separated from Spain. As soon as that happened, Texas separated from Mexico. This led to the Mexican-American War. And on it goes. And that concludes the story of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. Any questions?
George, how long did it take them when they got back to St. Louis to go to Washington, D.C.?
I couldn't answer that if it was pretty quick. Less than a month, I think, but I don't know specifically.
George, you know that while they were on their trip,
Yes.
Jefferson sent Zebulon Pike on similar expedition to explore first
South
up the Mississippi River and then into Colorado and down into that. Was Zebulon Pike part of this core discovery?
No, I don't know anything about that, but
He was
an
an Army officer, and
I'm sorry?
Zebulon Pike was an Army officer. He was a brigadier general, I think, at the time.
I don't doubt it. I just said I don't know anything about it. His name never came up in any of the stuff that I read, Jerry.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was two totally independent activities.
Okay. Good program, George.
Well, I'm
And as
glad you
usual-
guys like it.
That was very good.
Hey,
New Spain was bigger than I thought.
Especially before Napoleon got his half of it. West into places like Santa Fe and areas like that. It's pretty strong.